Imagine the strongest sorcerer who ever lived, a man who rewrote the laws of combat so completely that the entire jujutsu world had to admit there was simply no one like him. No technique could touch him. No curse could make him flinch. Gojo Satoru raised his hand, activated his infinity, stood at the absolute peak of everything his universe could produce, and met someone who didn't even notice. Not someone who overcame it with a clever technique, not a special grade curse with a domain, just a completely ordinary-looking man in a yellow jumpsuit with a bald head and tired eyes, Saitama. And infinity simply didn't matter. This is not a debate, this is a story. What happens when the man who cannot be touched meets the man who cannot be hurt? When infinity collides with someone who has already gone beyond infinity without even knowing it? The jujutsu world will never be the same. If you've ever wanted to see the most unbreakable man in anime come face to face with the most unbeatable man, and actually watch that collision unfold scene by scene, then you're in exactly the right place. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you're new, and drop in the comments which moment you think broke Gojo's brain the most. Let's get into it. To understand why this collision matters so much, you have to first understand what each of these men represents in their own world. To understand why this collision matters so much, you have to first understand what each of these men represents in their own world, because they are not just strong characters. They are the upper ceiling of their entire universes, the point beyond which their respective realities simply have no language to describe power anymore. Let's start with Gojo Satoru, because Gojo is the kind of character whose existence reshapes the political and spiritual architecture of an entire civilization. In the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, cursed energy is the fundamental currency of power. It flows from human negative emotions. It manifests as curses, and the strongest sorcerers are the ones who can generate and control the most of it with the highest degree of precision and technique. Most sorcerers spend their entire lives mastering one or two techniques, refining them to a razor's edge, because that is the natural ceiling that the jujutsu world operates under. And then Gojo was born, and he was born with not one but two of the rarest and most devastating techniques in the history of sorcery, simultaneously active inside him. The Limitless, which gives him absolute control over space at the quantum level, and the Six Eyes, which gives him a degree of cursed energy perception so precise that he can see the exact composition and flow of every molecule of cursed energy in his vicinity in real time. The Limitless alone would make him extraordinary. The Six Eyes alone would make him extraordinary. Together, they made him something that the jujutsu world had no category for. The reason Gojo cannot be touched is not just because he is fast or strong or well-trained, though he is all of those things at a level that most sorcerers cannot even comprehend. The reason he cannot be touched is because of infinity, the passive, always active application of the Limitless that sits between his body and the rest of the world at every single moment, awake or asleep, in battle or at rest. Infinity works by taking any object or attack approaching Gojo and mathematically dividing the remaining distance between that object and his skin into an infinite number of smaller and smaller intervals, so that the attack is always approaching but can never, in a physical sense, arrive. It's not a barrier you can break through with more force. It's not a wall you can climb over with more speed. It is a mathematical absolute, a spatial distortion rooted in the actual laws of how space subdivides itself. And the only way to get through it is either to operate on a level of conceptual reality that supersedes spatial mathematics entirely, or to use a technique specifically designed to reverse or circumvent the Limitless itself. In the entire jujutsu world, the number of beings who have managed to land a clean hit on Gojo Satoru without exploiting some very specific and very rare workaround can essentially be counted on one hand, and even those cases came with enormous asterisks. He is not just the strongest sorcerer alive. He is stronger than every special grade curse, stronger than every special grade sorcerer, stronger than the historical legends the jujutsu world tells itself at night to feel better about its own power ceiling. And Gojo knows this. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him as a character, not just the power, but the awareness that comes with it. Gojo carries his strength with a kind of casual, almost theatrical confidence that reads to most people as arrogance, and on the surface it is arrogance, but underneath it is something more interesting than simple pride. It is the specific loneliness of a person who has spent his entire life being the exception to every rule, who has never had to adjust, never had to adapt, never had to genuinely question whether he was going to survive a fight. His confidence is not performance. It is the honest emotional consequence of a life lived entirely without limits, without genuine stakes, without the particular terror of not knowing whether you are enough. He has never had to wonder. And because he has never had to wonder, there is a part of Gojo Satoru that has never been tested in the way that actually matters, the psychological, existential test of what happens when something refuses to stop. Now let's cross universes entirely, because the world Saitama comes from could not be more different in its texture and its logic. The world of One Punch Man is a world obsessed with heroes and monsters, a world that has institutionalized the response to supernatural threats through the Hero Association, a ranking system that grades heroes from C to S class based on their demonstrated combat ability and public contribution. It is a world full of genuinely powerful beings, dragon-level threats capable of leveling cities, monster kings who can reshape geography with their bodies, cosmic horrors that arrive from other dimensions with the specific intent of ending civilization. The S-class heroes who stand at the top of the Hero Association are not weak. Tatsumaki can lift cities with her psychokinesis. Bang can redirect any physical force with his martial arts mastery. Burroughs came from another galaxy specifically because he sensed a worthy opponent on Earth, and all of them together still represent something that Saitama has never genuinely been challenged by. Because Saitama's story is not really about fighting. It is about the hollowness that comes after you have already won everything, after you have already become everything you set out to become, and discovered that the destination contains nothing you were promised. He started training as an hobby, push-ups, sit-ups, squats, running, every single day for 3 years, no days off, no shortcuts, no secret techniques, and somewhere in that process, something in him broke, or maybe more accurately, something in him finished breaking, crossed through the point of ordinary human limitation and kept going until there was nothing left to break. His hair fell out. And with it went something else, the adrenaline, the fear response, the physical sensation of being in danger, the emotional electricity of a close call. He became absolutely, perfectly, terrifyingly strong, and in becoming that he lost the only thing he had actually wanted from strength, which was the feeling of it. Every fight since then has been the same one punch, and it is over, no matter who or what is standing across from him. Aliens, gods, kings of the underworld, beings who destroyed planets before arriving on Earth, one punch, and the conversation is finished. What makes Saitama's power so philosophically interesting in the context of a crossover like this is the question of what exactly he is and how his strength actually works. The official answer, within the narrative of One Punch Man, is that he broke his limiter, the natural ceiling that every living being has on their physical development, the biological governor that keeps the body from consuming itself in pursuit of strength beyond what it can structurally support. Saitama trained past that point, destroyed that limiter, and as a result his physical growth has no ceiling anymore. He doesn't get stronger from training in the traditional sense of gradual improvement. He simply has no upper boundary, which means that in any given moment, he is outputting exactly as much force as the situation requires. And in most situations, that force is so enormous that it resolves the fight before the audience can even register that the fight has started. But here is the thing. And this is the thing that makes a Saitama crossover genuinely fascinating rather than just a power-scaling exercise. No one in his universe has ever pushed him hard enough to find out what his actual maximum output looks like. The closest anything has come was his fight with Burroughs, a being explicitly stated to be capable of destroying planets, and who survived multiple exchanges with Saitama before being finished. And even then, Saitama himself acknowledged afterward that he was not fighting at full strength. Not because he was holding back strategically, but because the fight simply did not demand more from him. So when you put these two men in the same universe, when you ask the question this video is built around, what you are really asking is something more interesting than who would win in a fight. You are asking what happens when the man whose power has no ceiling meets the man whose technique was designed to answer every possible ceiling that has ever existed. You are asking what infinity looks like when it runs into something that is not subject to any mathematical limitation. You are asking, in a very real sense, whether Gojo's power, which is the most sophisticated and conceptually advanced offensive and defensive system in his universe, even means anything when it is aimed at a man whose body is the answer to every question about maximum force. That is the story we are about to tell. And it starts, as most catastrophic collisions do, with something much smaller, a random encounter, a misunderstanding, a moment when two beings who have never had to acknowledge another person's strength suddenly find themselves in the same space at the same time, looking at each other across a distance that neither of them is used to having to measure. The jujutsu world has a curse problem. Specifically, a curse problem that has spilled over through some catastrophic convergence of cursed energy and dimensional instability into a corner of the world that looks, from a satellite image, suspiciously like the city that Saitama calls home. And Gojo has been sent to deal with it, because Gojo is always sent to deal with the things that no one else can deal with. And he has shown up in his casual clothes with his blindfold on and his hands in his pockets, already a little bored by the prospect of another cleanup mission, already calculating how quickly he can finish this and get back to somewhere with better food. He does not expect to find anyone else there. Neither does Saitama. The city is quiet in the way that cities only get quiet when something has already gone wrong, and the people smart enough to notice have already left. Streets that should have afternoon foot traffic are empty. Storefronts are dark behind pulled shutters, and there is a particular kind of stillness in the air that anyone with combat experience learns to read immediately. The stillness that comes not from peace, but from the absence of everything that peace normally contains. Somewhere deeper in the city, cursed energy is pooling in concentrations that would make a normal sorcerer's stomach drop, thick and rotten, and layered in a way that suggests something very large and very old has been feeding here for longer than anyone noticed. Gojo walks through it like he is taking an afternoon stroll, hands loose at his sides, his blindfold sitting across his eyes in that characteristically casual way that manages to communicate simultaneously that he cannot see in the conventional sense, and that this is somehow making him more dangerous rather than less. He is cataloging the cursed energy signatures with his 6 eyes as he moves, building a real-time map of the threat concentration without needing to stop or slow down, or give any external indication that he is doing anything at all. And what his 6 eyes are telling him is that the primary source of this outbreak is about 4 blocks northeast, manifesting as something in the special grade range that has been absorbing ambient negative energy from human suffering long enough to develop a kind of territorial intelligence. Not smart, exactly, but aware in the way that very old and very hungry things become aware of their surroundings as an extension of their appetite. He has dealt with things like this before. He has dealt with things much worse than this before. He is already thinking about what he wants for dinner. And then his 6 eyes catch something else entirely. It is not cursed energy. It is not anything in the taxonomy of spiritual or metaphysical force that the jujutsu world has developed language for over centuries of accumulated knowledge. It is something stranger than that, a kind of presence that his 6 eyes register not as a power signature, but as an absence of resistance, the way you might notice a hole in a wall not by the wall itself, but by the light coming through it differently on the other side. Something in this city is carrying around a relationship with physical reality that does not conform to the rules his 6 eyes were built to interpret. And Gojo's brain, which processes information at a speed that most people cannot follow even when he narrates it out loud, pauses on this for exactly the length of time it takes him to round the corner of an empty intersection and come face to face with Saitama. Saitama is standing in the middle of the street looking at a torn-up piece of the road in front of him, with the expression of a man who has just realized he took a wrong turn and is mildly annoyed about it, but not annoyed enough to actually change his plans. He is in his hero suit, the yellow one-piece, the white cape, the red gloves, and he is holding what appears to be a grocery list in one hand, because he had been on his way to the supermarket when the sounds of cursed manifestation pulled him toward the disturbance in the specific way that sounds of disturbance always pull Saitama, not out of duty exactly but out of habit. The deeply ingrained reflex of a man who has spent years responding to threats as his primary mode of interacting with the world. He already dealt with the outer edges of the curse outbreak 3 blocks back. There had been some smaller manifestations, vaguely humanoid shapes made of compacted negative energy that had lurched toward him with what was probably meant to be terrifying aggression, and he had walked through them without adjusting his pace, the physical displacement of air from his movement alone enough to scatter them before they could do anything more threatening. He is not sure what is still going on deeper in the city. He is also not sure it matters very much. He looks up when Gojo rounds the corner, the way you look up when someone enters a room you are standing in, and for a moment the two of them just exist in each other's field of awareness without either of them doing anything about it. Gojo has stopped walking. Not because he is surprised. Gojo does not do surprise in any conventional sense, but because his 6 eyes are still trying to categorize what they are looking at, and for the first time in a very long time, they are coming up with answers that do not fit comfortably into any of the frameworks he has spent his life developing. There is no cursed energy signature coming off this person. There is no technique, no domain construction, no spiritual presence of any kind that the jujutsu taxonomy would recognize. What there is, instead, is a kind of physical density that his 6 eyes register the way you register a very deep note on a subwoofer, not as sound exactly, but as a pressure change in your chest, something felt before it is understood. The man in the yellow suit is not carrying power in any way Gojo has ever learned to read. He simply is power, in the most baseline physical sense, power so compressed and so fundamental that it exists below the level of technique entirely, the way gravity exists below the level of intention. Gojo tilts his head slightly and smiles in the specific way he smiles when something has managed to interest him, which is rare enough that the smile itself carries weight. Saitama, for his part, is looking at Gojo with the expression he uses for most new encounters, a kind of neutral, patient blankness that is not hostility and is not indifference but is the emotional resting state of a man who has stopped expecting anything to surprise him. He notices the blindfold. He notices the casual posture. He notices, in the vague, unscientific way that Saitama notices things, that this person feels different from the normal people he encounters on his way to deal with threats. Not different in a threatening way, just different in the way that occasionally, very occasionally, something stands in front of him, and his body reports back that this is not the same category of thing as everything else. It has been a long time since his body reported that. He does not react to it outwardly, he never does. Gojo speaks first, because Gojo always speaks first, because Gojo has never in his life met a silence he preferred to the sound of his own voice filling it. He says, in the tone of someone asking a completely reasonable question, that he didn't realize there was another contractor operating in this zone, and he follows it up immediately by nodding that whoever dispatched this person really should have coordinated because this is a jujutsu operation, and the cursed energy concentrations in this area are not something that conventional intervention is going to do anything about. He says all of this in the specific cadence of a man who is being technically informative, while also making it very clear that he considers himself to be the authority in this conversation, and he does it without any visible hostility, because Gojo's condescension is never hostile. It is simply the honest expression of a man who has genuinely never met anyone he considered his equal, and has therefore never developed the habit of speaking to another person as though they might be. Saitama listens to this with his grocery list still in his hand, and then says, after a pause that is not quite long enough to be rude, but is definitely long enough to communicate that he was not in any hurry to respond, that he does not know what jujutsu is, and that he was just going to handle whatever is causing the noise and then go buy cabbage because it is on sale today. There is a beat of silence. Gojo stares at him, which is a thing Gojo does even with a blindfold on, the directional precision of the 6 eyes giving him an awareness of exactly where another person's face is at all times. And then he laughs, genuinely, with actual amusement, because that is not the response he was expecting, and unexpected responses are among the very few things Gojo Satoru finds genuinely entertaining anymore. He asks, with the specific kind of curiosity that operates as a disguised challenge, what exactly this person thinks he is going to do about a special grade curse manifestation, because the implication in the question is obvious. You are not equipped for this. I am. Step aside and watch someone who knows what they are doing take care of it. Saitama looks at him for a moment, then looks back at the road ahead and says that he will probably just punch it. And the thing is, the deeply, specifically, cosmically funny thing about that exchange is that Saitama is not being dismissive or performatively confident or trying to establish dominance in the conversation. He is just accurately describing what he is going to do, the same way he would accurately describe any other planned action, with exactly as much gravity as the situation has earned from his perspective, which is not very much. He will punch it. That is the complete plan. That has always been the complete plan. The plan has never failed. Gojo processes this response and arrives at a conclusion that is partially correct and partially one of the most expensive miscalculations he will make in this entire encounter, which is that this person is overconfident in an amusing way and is probably some kind of enhanced human or low-level esper, who has survived enough encounters with minor threats to have developed an inflated sense of what they are capable of. He decides, in the way that Gojo decides things quickly, completely, with total commitment to the decision in the moment, that this is going to be interesting in a minor key, the kind of interesting that lasts about 90 seconds before resolving itself in a way that confirms everything he already believed. He has had these interactions before. They always end the same way. He tells Saitama, still smiling, that he is welcome to try and that he will watch, and that afterward he would be happy to explain what actually happened if Saitama finds the experience confusing. It is generous by Gojo's standards. It is almost kind. They walk toward the source of the disturbance together, not quite side by side, not quite single file, in the slightly awkward spatial arrangement of two people who have not established whether they are allies or simply moving in the same direction. And the cursed energy ahead of them swells and pulses in the darkness between buildings like something breathing, enormous and furious and absolutely certain of its own dominance over anything that might come for it. It has no idea what is about to walk through its front door. Neither, in a different and more consequential way, does Gojo. The curse manifests fully when they are half a block away, and it does so in the specific theatrical fashion that very old and very powerful curses tend to favor, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once, like a held breath finally released after hours of compression. the negative energy that had been pooling and layering in this district for weeks suddenly collapsing inward on itself, and then erupting outward in a shape that fills the space between buildings from ground to rooftop and keeps going. Something vast and wrongly proportioned and assembled from the accumulated grief and rage and despair of every person who had ever suffered in this part of the city, given form and hunger and a specific, singular directive that all curses share at their most fundamental level, which is to consume. It is enormous. It is special grade without any question or caveat. Its cursed energy output alone is generating visible atmospheric distortion, the air around it bending and darkening in ways that physics does not normally permit, and the sound it makes is less a roar than a frequency. Something below hearing that registers instead as pressure behind the eyes, and a sudden, instinctive understanding in the body that this is a thing that ends people. Gojo looks at it with his hands still in his pockets, and the expression of a man reading a menu at a restaurant he has been to many times before. Saitama looks at it, blinks once, and then looks sideways at Gojo to see what the plan is, because they walked here together, and it feels polite to at least acknowledge the other person before starting. Gojo tells him to stay back and watch, and there is no cruelty in it. It is simply the honest instruction of a man who is about to do something that proximity makes dangerous for bystanders, delivered with the same casual authority he uses for everything. He rolls his shoulders once, adjusts his stance in a way that is barely perceptible, and then the air around him changes in a way that is very perceptible, infinity expanding outward slightly as he brings his attention fully into the fight, the space around his body shimmering in a way that light was not designed to shimmer. The 6 eyes behind his blindfold shifting into full operational focus, and flooding him with more information about the curse's structure and energy composition than most sorcerers could process in an hour, delivered in real time with perfect clarity. He starts with blue, cursed technique lapse. Blue, and the way he does it is almost casual, the way a pianist runs scales before a performance. A single compressed point of negative spatial pressure launched toward the curse with enough force to pull everything in its vicinity toward it like a collapsing star, and it hits the curse dead center, and the curse absorbs the impact and staggers and screams in that subsonic frequency way, and then reforms. Because special grade curses do not go down to single technique applications no matter how precise, they are designed by their own nature to endure exactly this kind of assault and keep coming. Gojo knows this. He was not trying to finish it with blue. He was measuring it, using the response to the technique to map the curse's internal structure through his 6 eyes, reading the way the cursed energy redistributed after impact the way a doctor reads a scan, building a complete picture of where the vulnerability points are and what sequence of techniques will exploit them most efficiently. The curse comes back at him with everything it has, which is genuinely considerable, massive limbs of compacted cursed energy slamming toward him from multiple angles simultaneously. A coordinated assault that would require extraordinary speed and reflexes to navigate defensively, except that Gojo does not navigate it defensively, because infinity is already handling the defensive question before it is even fully posed. Each impact decelerating to nothing as it approaches his body, and dissipating against the mathematical absolute of spatial division, leaving him standing in the middle of what should be a devastating multi-directional barrage looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus. And this is the part where Saitama, watching from 30 meters back with his grocery list still folded in his hand, has his first genuinely interesting experience in recent memory, because what he is watching is not just someone fighting a monster. It is someone fighting a monster in a way that operates on a completely different axis from anything he has encountered before. Every hero Saitama has ever seen fight relies, at the most fundamental level, on the same basic framework: move fast enough or hit hard enough or take hits well enough to come out ahead on the exchange, which is a framework that scales upward into increasingly absurd versions of itself, but never changes its essential structure. What Gojo is doing is something categorically different from that. He is not trading with the curse. He is existing in a spatial relationship with the curse that makes trading irrelevant, operating in a pocket of physical reality that he has personally redefined to exclude the possibility of the curse reaching him. And from inside that pocket, he is dissecting the curse's energy architecture with a precision that is closer to surgery than combat. Saitama watches this with genuine attention, which is notable because genuine attention is something Saitama deploys rarely and reluctantly, conditioned by years of fights that resolved before attention was useful. He is not impressed in the conventional sense. Impressed is an emotion that requires a reference point for what impressive looks like relative to what you expected, and Saitama's reference points for combat have been so thoroughly destroyed by his own existence that the machinery of impression does not really function in him anymore. But he is interested. In the specific way he gets interested in things that are different from the pattern, and what is different about this pattern is the spatial component. The way this blindfolded man is not so much fighting the curse as rewriting the terms under which the fight is allowed to take place. Gojo finishes his assessment, and then he ends the fight, and the way he ends it is with hollow purple, the synthesis of blue and red, the imaginary technique that combines attraction and repulsion into a single point of erasure that moves through the target and simply removes from physical existence everything it passes through, not destroying it in any conventional energetic sense, but unmapping it from reality in a way that leaves no trace and permits no regeneration. The purple passes through the curse like a thought passing through a mind, and in its wake there is nothing, not wreckage, not residue, just the clean absence of what had been there, the space it occupied suddenly vacant in a way that feels almost philosophical. The entire fight, from the curse's full manifestation to its complete erasure, has taken less than 3 minutes. Gojo lowers his hand and turns back towards Saitama with the expression of a man who has just completed a task he found mildly engaging and is now ready to return to the rest of his day. He says something about that being a relatively interesting specimen for a district-level manifestation, which in Gojo's personal rating scale of curses encountered means it was about a 4 out of 10, maybe a 5. And he delivers this assessment in the tone of a food critic describing a meal that was competently prepared but not revelatory. Saitama looks at the space where the curse used to be. Then he looks at Gojo. Then he says, in the honest, unvarnished way he says things, that the technique with the purple thing was pretty cool. And Gojo, who receives compliments from powerful beings as a matter of routine, and has developed a kind of sophisticated immunity to praise that makes genuine appreciation almost impossible to experience anymore, feels something very slightly different about this particular observation, because it is delivered without any of the social mechanics that usually surround compliments. No awe, no fear, no performance of deference, no agenda. It is just an honest aesthetic judgment from a person who watched something happen and found it aesthetically pleasing, the way you might tell someone their shoes are nice, because you genuinely think their shoes are nice. It is possibly the most uncomplicated compliment Gojo has received in years. He decides, on the basis of this, that he likes Saitama slightly. Not as an equal. The category of equal is one Gojo has essentially never populated, but as an interesting anomaly worth additional observation, the way a scientist might find a data point interesting without it threatening the theory. He asks, with the casual interrogative style of someone who is curious but not invested in the answer, whether Saitama actually fights things or whether he just observes, because watching from 30 meters back during a special grade encounter suggests a degree of tactical caution that does not quite square with the confidence of "I'll just punch it" that he had been handed earlier. Saitama says there was only one curse, so there was no reason for 2 people to deal with it, and that he was waiting to see what would happen. Gojo processes this and then asks, with slightly more interest than he intended to show, what Saitama concluded from watching. It is a question he does not normally ask, because he does not normally care what observers conclude about his technique, but there is something about the total absence of performed reaction in this person that makes him want to know what the unfiltered read looks like. Saitama is quiet for a moment, in the way he is quiet when he is actually thinking rather than just pausing, and then he says that the technique was very good and clearly worked very well, but that it seemed like a lot of steps for something that could be solved with one punch. The silence that follows this is a different kind of silence from the ones that had come before in this conversation. It is the silence of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the most efficient and the most devastating and the most completely sufficient response to any threat that has ever presented itself, suddenly receiving from an utterly unremarkable-looking bald man in a yellow suit the specific criticism that his method of solving problems is unnecessarily complicated, and finding that he does not have an immediate answer for it. Not because the criticism is obviously correct, but because he cannot immediately locate the place where it is obviously wrong. He smiles, but it is a slightly different smile from the ones before, narrower, more focused, with something behind it that is sharper than amusement and closer to the thing that lives just beneath his confidence, the thing that only activates when he is standing in front of something that has not yet been fully categorized. He tells Saitama that if punching is really his complete solution to everything, he would love to see that demonstrated on something worth punching. Saitama shrugs and says sure. And that is the moment, the casual, unweighted, completely undramatic moment, when this stops being an encounter and starts being something else, something that neither of them has a word for yet because neither of them has ever been in this position before, standing across from a person who represents the exact category of problem that their entire existence has never been designed to process. The next threat finds them 20 minutes later. It is bigger. It is angrier. It has been drawn by the residual energy of the first engagement, attracted the way predators are attracted to the sight of another predator's kill, and it arrives with the specific ferocity of something that has never lost and does not understand the concept of what losing would feel like. Gojo starts running his assessment protocol, 6 eyes already mapping the energy signature, already building the approach sequence, already 5 moves ahead of where the fight currently is. Saitama rolls his neck once, takes 1 step forward and punches it. The curse does not explode. It does not scatter. It does not come apart in the dramatic slow-motion fashion of things that have been hit very hard. It simply stops existing, the way a soap bubble stops existing when you touch it. Except the soap bubble in this analogy was the size of a building and made of compressed supernatural horror, and the touch in this analogy registered on the surrounding city blocks as a shockwave that rattled every window within a quarter mile and left a crater in the street that was perfectly circular and exactly 1 arm's length deep. Gojo stands very still for a moment. His 6 eyes are doing something they have never quite done before in the middle of a combat assessment, which is abandoning the assessment entirely, because the subject of the assessment has been removed from the situation faster than the assessment could reach a conclusion. He looks at the crater. He looks at Saitama, who is already looking at his grocery list again and making a small sound that suggests he has just remembered he also needs green onions. And somewhere deep behind the blindfold, behind the 6 eyes, behind the infinity and the limitless and every layer of the most sophisticated power system his universe has ever produced, something very small and very old and very unused stirs in Gojo Satoru's chest. It is the thing that stirs when something does not fit. It is the thing that, in another person, might be called the beginning of doubt, but in Gojo is closer to something more dangerous and more interesting than doubt. The awakening of genuine curiosity about whether the map he has been using his entire life actually covers all the territory that exists. He does not say anything. He watches Saitama put the grocery list back in his pocket and turn to check if there is anything else making noise nearby, and he thinks, for the first time in a very long time, that he wants to actually understand what he is looking at. The thing about Saitama is that he does not have a switch. Every powerful character in the history of anime has some version of a switch, a threshold moment where the narrative gives them permission to stop holding back, where the emotional stakes climb high enough or the opponent proves worthy enough that the character reaches inward and pulls out the version of themselves that they normally keep locked behind restraint and discipline, and the social contract of not destroying everything around them. Goku has it. Naruto has it. Even Gojo has it in his own way, the moment when the blindfold comes off and the six eyes open fully, and the performance of casual invincibility gets replaced by the genuine article. Every strong character has a gear they shift into when the situation demands it, a higher register of themselves that the fight has to earn. Saitama does not have that. What Saitama has instead is something much stranger and in some ways much more unsettling, which is a permanent, unvarying flatline of output that simply happens to be located at a level so far above every other output on the chart that the chart itself becomes meaningless. He does not power up. He does not unlock. He does not dig deep or push past his limits or find the strength he did not know he had, because he broke through all of those narrative structures years ago during a training regimen so mundane that the manga presents it almost as a joke. And what is left on the other side of all those broken structures is not drama but arithmetic. A man whose answer to every problem is the same answer, delivered at the same volume, with the same facial expression, and that answer is always sufficient. Not because the problems are small, but because the answer is larger than any problem the universe has so far managed to construct. But here is what happens on this particular afternoon in this particular empty city street. In the hour after the second curse has been erased, and Gojo has gone quiet in a way that is qualitatively different from his usual quiet, and Saitama has finished updating his grocery list, and they are walking again, because there are more disturbances registering on the edges of Gojo's six eyes perception, and the cleanup operation is not finished. What happens is not a switch being flipped, because there is no switch, but it is the closest thing to an awakening that Saitama's particular neurology and physiology permit, which is the slow, reluctant, almost resentful realization that something in the current situation is different from the pattern. It starts with the third curse. The third curse of this afternoon is different from the first two in a way that Gojo clocks immediately, and Saitama does not clock at all, because the difference is expressed entirely in the language of cursed energy, which Saitama has no framework for reading. What Gojo's six eyes are telling him, in the microsecond after the third manifestation becomes fully visible at the end of the block, is that this is not a naturally occurring curse in the way the first two were naturally occurring. This is something that has been constructed, deliberately and with considerable sophistication, by a hand that understands the architecture of cursed energy well enough to build something specifically optimized for the weaknesses in standard sorcerer combat approaches. Someone has made this. Someone who knows what they are doing has assembled this curse the way an engineer assembles a weapon, and they have assembled it with specific, targeted design features that Gojo recognizes the signature of immediately, because he has seen this engineering philosophy before, in the work of people who have spent their lives studying him specifically, and trying to build the thing that can get through infinity. This curse has a technique built into it. A reversal technique, specifically, a method of approaching a target by not approaching a target, by existing in a spatial relationship with the destination that circumvents the normal geometry of distance, blinking through the infinity of subdivided intervals by simply redefining the interval as zero from a different reference frame. It is not a perfect circumvention. Gojo can see the structural limitations of the technique in the way the curse's energy is configured, can see the places where the engineering is approximate rather than precise, where the designer got close to the answer but not all the way there. But it is close enough that he cannot engage it with the same passive infinity approach he used for the first two curses. This one requires active attention. This one requires him to be present in the fight in a way that the first two did not. He tells Saitama, without looking at him, that this one is different and that he should keep clear because the spatial distortions this curse generates could cause serious injury to anyone nearby who does not have cursed energy protection. He says it in the same tone as before, informative, authoritative, not unkind, and he is already moving as he says it, the infinity around him shifting from passive to active configuration, his hands coming out of his pockets for the first time since they started walking, the whole quality of his presence in the space sharpening into something denser and more deliberate. Saitama watches him engage the curse, and what he watches is, genuinely, objectively extraordinary Gojo operating at a level of active combat commitment that he had not shown in the first two encounters. The six eyes fully deployed, the infinity oscillating in real time to counter the curse's spatial technique every time it attempts to use the reversal approach. Blue and red being deployed in rapid alternating sequences to disrupt the curse's energy configuration and prevent it from stabilizing into a position from which it can launch the technique cleanly. It is, by any reasonable metric, one of the most technically sophisticated displays of combat ability that has ever occurred on a public street, a performance of such complete and overwhelming mastery that it should read as beautiful. And it does read as beautiful, the way very precise and very complex things read as beautiful when they are executed by someone who has spent their entire life making this specific complexity look effortless. And Saitama watches all of it with the patient, neutral attention of a man sitting in a waiting room, because from his perspective what he is watching is someone solving a problem through a very impressive sequence of steps that he cannot evaluate technically but can evaluate in terms of outcome. And the outcome he is observing is that the problem is taking a while to solve, which from Saitama's relationship with problem solving represents a data point he has not encountered very often. The fight goes on for longer than Gojo intended. Not long in any absolute sense, 4 minutes, maybe 5, but long enough that by the end of it Gojo has committed more active cursed energy expenditure to a single engagement than he has needed to in recent memory. Long enough that he finishes the curse with hollow purple again, but this time with both hands rather than one, the technique requiring the full synthesis of both blue and red at maximum compression to punch through the curse's reversal defense cleanly. When it is over, he is standing in the same posture as before, hands lowering, expression unchanged, and anyone who did not know Gojo Satoru extremely well would see no difference in him at all. But Saitama is looking at him with an attention that has shifted slightly in quality, because Saitama, for all his apparent blankness, is not unintelligent. He is specifically, precisely intelligent about the things that matter to him, and combat is the thing that matters to him most, the thing he has the most accumulated experiential data about, and his experiential data is telling him that the man across from him just worked harder on that problem than he worked on the previous two combined. This is interesting to Saitama not because it suggests weakness, but because it suggests variability, and variability is something he has essentially stopped expecting from anything. Gojo, for his part, has arrived at a decision point in the specific internal conversation he has been having with himself since the moment Saitama erased the second curse with a single punch. The decision point is this. He wants to understand what Saitama is, and the only way to understand what Saitama is in any meaningful sense is to see Saitama respond to something that actually tests him, because watching Saitama punch things that do not test him tells Gojo nothing useful about where the ceiling is. He needs to engineer a situation in which Saitama has to reach, has to extend, has to give the fight more than the baseline, and the only way to engineer that situation is to be the thing that requires more than the baseline, He does not make a speech about it. He does not announce what he is about to do. He simply turns to Saitama and asks, in a tone that is conversational but carries an unmistakable undercurrent of something more purposeful, whether Saitama would be interested in a sparring exchange, framed as a practical demonstration for mutual understanding, one professional to another, completely controlled, just to get a sense of what each of them is actually working with. Saitama looks at him for a moment with the expression he uses when he is genuinely considering something rather than just waiting for the conversation to be over. And something happens in his face in that moment that is very subtle and very significant. A slight change in the quality of the blankness, like a room that was empty getting slightly less empty, without anything visible being added to it. His body, which maintains the same posture in every context, has shifted by a degree or two in a way that is not defensive and is not aggressive, but is something that has not been present in any of his postures today, which is attentive. Actually, genuinely attentive, in the way he gets attentive when something has managed to reach through the flat line and register as potentially worth his full presence. He says okay. And that single syllable, delivered in Saitama's characteristic tone of absolute unexcited acceptance, contains within it something that Gojo Satoru has not received from another person in a very long time, which is the complete absence of performance. No excitement at the prospect of facing Gojo. No fear at the prospect of facing Gojo. No calculation of odds or assessment of risk or strategic repositioning of self-presentation in response to the social weight of what is being proposed. Just okay because it was asked, and okay is the honest answer, and Saitama has never seen any reason to give anything other than the honest answer. They move to an open area, a wide intersection 3 blocks over where the buildings are lower, and the space is broader, and the collateral damage from a controlled exchange can be kept to something defensible, and they face each other across about 20 meters of cracked asphalt, and the city is still empty around them. And the afternoon light is doing the thing afternoon light does in empty cities, which is making everything look simultaneously very clear and very abandoned. Gojo removes his blindfold. This is significant. The 6 eyes at full exposure, unfiltered by the blindfold that normally limits their output to something his nervous system can sustain without burning, represent Gojo operating at the peak of his perceptual capacity. Every photon of cursed energy in the vicinity mapped and analyzed in real time, his spatial awareness extended to its absolute maximum radius. His reaction processing accelerated to the point where the difference between his perception of time and normal human perception of time is not a matter of degree, but of category. He does this rarely and deliberately, reserving it for encounters that genuinely demand it. And the fact that he is doing it now, for a sparring session with a man he has known for less than 2 hours, means that something in Gojo has already concluded below the level of conscious articulation, that the category of this encounter is different from what he initially assessed it to be. He does not charge. He extends one hand and releases a compressed blue, not at full power, nothing close to full power, maybe 30% of what the technique can generate, aimed directly at Saitama's center of mass, with the intent of pulling him forward and off balance, disrupting his footing, giving Gojo the spatial advantage that the technique is designed to create. The blue hits Saitama. Or rather, the blue reaches Saitama, and Saitama is still standing exactly where he was, in exactly the same posture, and his feet have not moved, and his expression has not changed. And what Gojo's 6 eyes are reporting back about the interaction between the spatial compression of the blue technique and the physical reality of the person it was aimed at is something that takes him a full second to process, which is an eternity by 6 eyes standards. Because what his 6 eyes are reporting is that the blue did not pull Saitama forward, because the spatial pressure that the blue generates was insufficient to create a net force differential against whatever Saitama's physical presence is doing to the local space around him by simply existing in it. The technique did not fail. The technique worked perfectly. The technique was just not enough. Gojo stares at him. The six eyes are doing something between assessment and recalibration. And somewhere in the complex, layered, extraordinary machinery of Gojo Satoru's mind, the thing that stirred earlier stirs again, louder this time, with considerably more urgency, because what he is holding in this moment is data, and the data is telling him something that his entire life's experience has not prepared him to receive. He is going to have to try. Actually try. For the first time in longer than he can honestly remember, Gojo Satoru is going to have to reach for something beyond what he normally deploys, and the emotion that accompanies that realization is not fear, and it is not panic, and it is not the destabilizing vertigo of a man watching his world collapse. It is something that he recognizes from very deep in his memory, from before he fully understood what he was. From the very earliest days of his training, when he was still becoming rather than already being, the sharp and electric and almost unbearably alive feeling of not knowing how this ends. Saitama rolls his shoulders on the other side of the intersection, and for just a moment, for the first time in years, he does too. What happens next does not begin with an explosion. It does not begin with a battle cry or a dramatic declaration, or any of the conventional signals that anime uses to tell its audience that the real fight is starting now, that everything before this was prologue, and now the actual story is being written. It begins with Gojo taking a breath, and in that breath, in the specific quality of attention and intention that he loads into it, something changes in the atmosphere of the intersection that is not visible and not audible but is absolutely, physically present. A change in pressure, a change in the texture of the space itself. The way the air feels different before a storm, not because anything has happened yet, but because the conditions for something happening have been fully assembled and are now simply waiting for the moment. He launches red next, full red, not the 30% blue he opened with but genuine maximum output red, the opposite of blue, the technique that generates repulsion rather than attraction, a compressed point of cursed energy reversal that pushes everything in its vicinity away from itself, with a force so enormous that at full power it can level city blocks, can crack the foundation of buildings half a kilometer from the point of impact, can generate a shockwave capable of turning the physical environment in its radius into a demolition site in the time it takes to draw a breath. Full red from Gojo Satoru is not something that has a comfortable comparison point in normal human experience of force. It is the kind of power that redefines the local definition of what is possible, that takes the question of whether anything can survive it, and answers it with such overwhelming finality that the question itself seems naive in retrospect. It hits Saitama in the chest. Saitama takes one step back. One step with his right foot, the heel of his boot scraping against the cracked asphalt, the ground beneath that foot cratering very slightly from the force transfer, not because the red pushed him back with anything close to its full intended effect, but because the force that did reach him through whatever his body does to incoming energy was still enough to shift his weight distribution by a margin that his legs compensated for automatically. The way any balanced physical system compensates for an unexpected input by adjusting its base. He takes one step back, and then his left foot slides forward again, and he is in the same position as before, looking across the intersection at Gojo with an expression that has changed by exactly 1 degree. A slight narrowing of the eyes, not suspicious, not threatened, but the specific micro-expression of someone who has just felt something that was mildly more noticeable than what they expected, the way you might blink when a car horn sounds louder than you anticipated. One step back. Gojo has thrown the technique that leveled a significant portion of a mountain range in a training exercise, the technique that generates force measured in units that conventional physics finds uncomfortable, and he has moved Saitama one step backward. The six eyes are processing this with a speed and completeness that Gojo's conscious experience of the moment cannot quite keep pace with, which is itself unprecedented. The six eyes have never outrun his ability to interpret their output before, because nothing has ever given them input complex enough to require more processing time than his cognition can handle in real time. What they are processing is not just the physical result of the impact, but the energy interaction data from the moment of contact. The way the Red's cursed energy met Saitama's physical reality, and what happened at the boundary between them. And what happened is something that does not have a clean entry in the taxonomy of techniques and counters and energy interactions that Gojo has spent his entire life building and refining. The Red did not get blocked. There is no technique operating in Saitama that redirected or absorbed or neutralized the cursed energy of the Red. The six eyes would see that immediately, would identify the mechanism and classify it, and tell Gojo exactly what he is dealing with. What happened instead is something more fundamental than technique. The cursed energy of the Red contacted the physical surface of Saitama's body, and the physical surface of Saitama's body simply did not participate in the interaction the way physical surfaces are supposed to participate, the way every physical surface in the history of every technique Gojo has ever deployed has participated. The force arrived, and the target absorbed it in the specific sense that the target experienced a force differential sufficient to shift one step's worth of weight. And the rest, the enormous, catastrophic, city-leveling rest of it, dissipated not through any active process, but through the passive consequence of making contact with a physical system that was not interested in being moved more than one step. In the language of physics, what Saitama's body did to the Red is something like what an ocean does to a stone thrown into it, not stopping it through resistance, not redirecting it through technique, but simply encompassing it within a system so much larger than the input that the input's effect on the system is negligible, a ripple that reaches one step from shore and then is absorbed into the vastness of the water as though it was always going to end this way. Gojo has never hit an ocean before. Every opponent he has ever faced has been, in this metaphor, some variety of stone, hard or soft, large or small, but stone, a discrete and finite object that responds to force the way finite objects respond to force, which is by being moved or broken or destroyed. Saitama is not stone. Saitama is not any material in the taxonomy. Saitama is the thing the taxonomy was built on top of without knowing it was there. Gojo does something he has not done in a combat context in longer than he can remember, which is stop. Not retreat, not reposition, not redirect into another technique while maintaining pressure. He stops, stands in the middle of the intersection, and thinks, because the data he has just received requires thinking, requires the kind of deliberate, unhurried processing that combat normally does not permit, because combat normally does not wait for you to be ready to continue. But Saitama is also stopped, standing on his side of the intersection with his arms loose at his sides. And the reason Saitama is stopped is not tactical patience or the strategic generosity of an opponent giving him time to recover. It is simply that Saitama does not feel any particular urgency about continuing, because urgency requires a perception of stakes, and Saitama's perception of stakes in this moment is the same as it is in every moment, which is present but not activated. A pilot light rather than a flame. What Gojo is thinking, in the silence of this stopped moment, is a question that restructures itself several times before it arrives at its final form. It starts as a question about technique. What counters this? What approach gets through this? What sequence of applications solves this particular problem? Because that is the natural first language of someone who has spent their entire life solving problems through technique, through the specific and sophisticated application of ability to obstacle. And then it restructures, because the data is telling him that the technique question is the wrong question, that he is trying to solve an ocean with a stone-breaking tool, that the framework he is applying to this problem is a framework that was built for a category of problem this situation does not belong to. And then it arrives, finally, at the question it has been trying to become since the moment Saitama took one step back from full red, which is not a technique question at all but a reality question, a question about the nature of what he is looking at, and what it means for the map of the world that he has been using as his reference for his entire life. The question is, what is a limiter? Not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the specific, concrete, functional sense. What is the thing that limits, and why does it exist, and what is its relationship to his own power? Because Gojo Satoru has spent his entire life being described as the man without a ceiling, the sorcerer who pushed the limitless to its absolute maximum, who inherited the 6 eyes and the limitless simultaneously, and in doing so became the complete expression of what that combination of abilities can produce in a human vessel. He has been told, implicitly and explicitly by everyone who has ever evaluated him, that he represents the end point of what the jujutsu world's power system can generate, not a step on the way to something more, but the destination itself, the thing the whole system was building toward. And he has believed this not out of vanity but out of evidence, because the evidence has consistently, comprehensively supported it. Nothing has ever suggested otherwise. But Saitama broke his limiter. Not the limitless, not the sophisticated, quantum-spatial, cursed energy-based technique that Gojo was born with, but the limiter, the thing that lives underneath technique entirely, the biological and perhaps metaphysical governor that every living being carries inside them that sets the boundary on what their physical development can reach. Saitama trained until that thing broke, and what was left when it broke was a body with no upper boundary on its physical output, which means that Saitama's strength is not a fixed quantity, but a relational one. It is always and exactly as much as it needs to be to resolve the situation, and it is anchored not to any ceiling of his own, but to the ceiling of whatever he is facing. Which means his effective maximum scales perfectly and automatically to whatever maximum is being presented to him. Which means that the question of whether Gojo can hit hard enough to reach Saitama's ceiling is not a question about Gojo's power. It is a question about whether Gojo's power has a ceiling, and if that ceiling is lower than the automatic scaling that Saitama's broken limiter generates in response to it. And the data from the red interaction, the 6 eyes data that is still being processed and organized and cross-referenced against everything Gojo knows about energy interactions and physical systems, is suggesting something that he does not want to conclude but cannot intellectually avoid, which is that infinity, his infinity, the cornerstone of his invincibility, the mathematical absolute that has made him untouchable for his entire career, may not be the right tool for this problem, in the way that it is the right tool for every other problem. Because infinity works by dividing the approach distance into infinite intervals, making arrival impossible through mathematical necessity. And mathematical necessity operates on the assumption that the force approaching is finite, that it has a value, and that value, however large, can be contained within the logic of infinite subdivision. But what Saitama's body generates is not, in any functional sense, a finite quantity. It is a quantity that responds to resistance by scaling above the resistance, which means that the question of whether infinity can contain it is not a static question, but a dynamic one, a question that re-asks itself every microsecond, as Saitama's output adjusts to the resistance it encounters, and Gojo's 6 eyes are beginning to tell him. With the specific clinical clarity they reserve for conclusions they have fully confirmed, that the answer to that dynamically re-asked question is not consistently yes. He opens his domain. Unlimited void, the complete expression of his domain expansion, the technique that takes the infinite information of the limitless and imposes it on a target's consciousness, flooding their mind with so much simultaneous input that normal cognitive function collapses entirely, leaving them physically present but mentally paralyzed, overwhelmed by the experience of genuine infinity delivered directly into their nervous system in a single unmediated wave. It is the technique that ends conversations. It is the technique that has never failed to end conversations, because there is no nervous system in the jujutsu world that has demonstrated the capacity to process infinite simultaneous information without shutting down. And shutting down is, for practical purposes, equivalent to losing. The domain expands around them both, the reality of the intersection replaced by the vast, lightless, incomprehensible expanse of genuine unlimited void, infinite information moving in every direction at once, and Gojo watches with his 6 eyes as the wave of it reaches Saitama and makes contact with his consciousness. And Saitama stands in the unlimited void and looks around at the infinite expanse of it with his head tilted slightly to one side, the way he tilts his head when something is aesthetically interesting without being threatening. And then he looks back at Gojo across the void, with the expression of a man who has just been shown something genuinely impressive, and is taking a moment to appreciate it honestly before returning to the matter at hand. He is not paralyzed. His cognition has not collapsed. The infinite simultaneous information of the unlimited void has contacted his consciousness, and his consciousness has done what his body did with the red, not processed it, not resisted it, but simply encompassed it within a system too large for the input to overwhelm, the way an ocean encompasses a wave, absorbing it into itself without the ocean becoming anything other than what it already was. Saitama exists in a state beyond limits, and the unlimited void, for all its genuine infinity, is still a technique, still a constructed thing, still a thing with an author and a mechanism and a specific operational logic that exists within the framework of a world that has limits. And Saitama is from the place on the other side of that framework. He is not beyond the unlimited void because he is stronger than it in any conventional sense. He is beyond the unlimited void because the unlimited void speaks the language of limits, even in its infinity. It is infinite within the system, and Saitama is outside the system, and outside and inside are not the same address no matter how large the inside gets. Gojo collapses the domain. He stands in the intersection again, in the late afternoon light, and across from him, Saitama is scratching the back of his head in the specific way he does when he is mildly confused about something, and he asks, in genuine curiosity with no performance in it at all, whether that was supposed to do something, because he could tell something was happening but he was not sure what the intended effect was. And Gojo Satoru, the strongest sorcerer in the history of the jujutsu world, the man who has never had to ask this question in a combat context, opens his mouth and closes it, and opens it again, and what comes out is not a technique and not a declaration and not the confident preamble to his next approach. It is a laugh, a real one, surprised out of him by the sheer audacity of the situation. The absolute cosmic absurdity of standing in a cracked intersection, having just deployed his most complete and devastating technique, and being asked by a bald man in a yellow suit whether it was supposed to do something. He says yes, it was supposed to do something. Saitama nods thoughtfully and says he thought so, and then he asks if Gojo wants to see what he does when he actually tries, because so far he has just been using his normal punch, and he can feel, in the very faint and rarely consulted register of his physical perception, that this situation might be one of the first in a very long time that is worth something more than his normal punch. The air in the intersection changes again, but this time it is not Gojo changing it. The punch that Saitama throws when he actually tries is not louder than his normal punch. It is not more visually dramatic, does not generate more light or more color or more of the theatrical atmospheric spectacle that powerful techniques in anime tend to produce as a kind of visual announcement of their own significance. It does not have a name. It does not have a form. It is, in every external observable sense, the same motion as every other punch Saitama has ever thrown. The same mechanics, the same geometry, the same economy of movement that comes from a body that has so thoroughly internalized the act of punching that it has reduced the motion to its absolute irreducible minimum. No wasted movement, no performance, just the clean transfer of intent into action with nothing in between. What is different is the pressure that precedes it. Gojo feels it through his 6 eyes before the punch moves, which should not be possible because the 6 eyes perceive cursed energy, and Saitama does not generate cursed energy. But what the 6 eyes are registering in the half-second before Saitama's fist begins its arc is a change in the local physical environment so comprehensive and so sudden that it bypasses the specific taxonomy of cursed energy entirely and registers instead as raw data about the state of reality in Saitama's immediate vicinity, a compression of potential, a drawing inward of something that has no name in the jujutsu world's language, but that Gojo's 6 eyes recognize instinctively as the signature of something about to happen that will require a completely different category of response than anything he has prepared. Every molecule of air in the intersection pulls towards Saitama in the instant before he commits, not because of any technique manipulating space or pressure, but because the physical reality of what Saitama is about to release is so enormous that even the anticipation of it creates a localized effect on the environment. The way the gravity of a very large object bends the space around it before anything has actually moved. Gojo makes a decision in that half-second that is the most honest decision he has made in a combat context in his entire life, which is to meet it directly, to not redirect or absorb or circumvent, but to stand in front of it with everything he has, and find out what everything he has actually means when it is measured against something that has no ceiling. He brings infinity to its maximum active configuration, not the passive ambient infinity of his everyday existence, but the fully conscious, fully committed, maximally dense spatial division that he normally reserves for techniques he considers genuinely threatening, and he layers red underneath it as a force buffer, and he plants his feet. And he looks at Saitama across the intersection with the 6 eyes open completely, and his full attention assembled into the sharpest point it has ever been aimed at a single target, and he waits. The punch arrives. What happens when the punch meets infinity at maximum density is something that the physics of the jujutsu world does not have adequate language for, because the jujutsu world's physics was built on the assumption that infinity represents an absolute, that the mathematical subdivision of approach distance into infinite intervals is a terminal answer to the question of how anything gets through. Not a very good answer, but the best answer available in a universe where everything that exists eventually submits to some form of mathematical description. Saitama's punch does not submit to mathematical description. It is not fast enough to outrun the subdivision. It does not need to be, because speed is still a quantity, and quantities are still subject to infinite subdivision the same way distances are. What it does instead is something more fundamental than speed, which is that it carries within it a force so completely without ceiling that the infinite subdivision of its approach, rather than stopping it, simply gives it an infinite number of points at which to apply pressure against the interior logic of the division itself, and the interior logic of the division, which is ultimately grounded in the physical laws of the universe it was built inside, has a tolerance for how much simultaneous pressure it can sustain before the mathematics stop working. The mathematics stop working, not permanently, not catastrophically in the sense of infinity being destroyed as a technique. It is not a thing that can be destroyed any more than a mathematical principle can be destroyed. But in this specific moment, in this specific intersection, against this specific input, the infinity at maximum density reaches the boundary of what its internal logic can contain, and the punch passes through it, not cleanly, not easily, with enormous resistance from every layer of spatial division it moves through, but through, continuing forward with enough remaining force that, When it reaches the outer edge of the red buffer Gojo has laid beneath the infinity, it detonates against the repulsion field. And the detonation sends a shockwave outward in every direction that takes out every remaining window in a 4-block radius simultaneously, and leaves a perfectly circular depression in the asphalt, extending 30 meters from the center point in every direction, and strips every piece of loose material from every surface it reaches with the comprehensive thoroughness of a pressure washer, operated at a scale that pressure washers are not supposed to reach. Gojo is standing at the center of this. He has been moved backward by the force transfer through his own red buffer, his feet leaving parallel tracks in the asphalt for about 3 meters before he stopped, and he is standing at the end of those tracks now with his coat disturbed, and his hair displaced, and his 6 eyes wide open, and processing the aftermath data with a completeness and a speed that his conscious mind is struggling to keep up with, and what his conscious mind eventually catches up to. About 2 seconds after the shockwave finishes propagating, is that he is still standing, that his infinity held enough to prevent the punch from landing on his body directly, that the spatial division and the red buffer together absorbed sufficient force to make the difference between what happened and what would have happened if the punch had reached him cleanly, and that the difference between those two outcomes is something he is going to spend a very long time thinking about. He looks at his hands. He looks at the tracks his feet left in the asphalt. He looks at the radius of destruction extending from the point where the punch met his defenses, and he does the calculation that his 6 eyes are already completing for him. The calculation of what force level is required to produce this particular pattern of physical consequence in this particular environment. And the number the 6 eyes return is a number that makes the special grade curse from earlier today look like a minor inconvenience. Makes every opponent Gojo has ever faced look like a minor inconvenience. Makes Gojo's own maximum output look like something in the same general direction as the answer, but significantly short of the actual value. Across the intersection, Saitama is looking at his fist with a slightly surprised expression, the specific expression he has when something has required more from him than he expected, which is rare enough that the expression itself looks slightly unfamiliar on his face, like a muscle being used after a long period of disuse. He opens and closes his hand once, as though checking that it worked the way he intended, and then he looks up at Gojo, and his expression shifts into something that is not quite recognition, but is the closest thing to recognition that Saitama's face knows how to form anymore. The expression of someone who has encountered something that has briefly, partially, incompletely, but genuinely closed the distance between the world as it normally is and the world as it once was. Back when the world still held things that made him feel like this. He says quietly that Gojo is pretty tough. And this is the moment, not the punch, not the hollow purple, not the unlimited void, not any of the techniques or the force measurements or the spatial mathematics. This is the moment that matters most in this entire story, because what Saitama is expressing with those 3 words is not a combat assessment, and not a compliment in the conventional sense, and not the social performance of sportsmanship between opponents who respect each other. He is expressing something much rarer and much more personal, which is genuine surprise, genuine and unperformed surprise at finding something in the world that made his body reach in a way it had not reached in years, that pulled from him a punch that required more than his baseline, that gave him, for the duration of a single motion, the feeling he has been chasing since the day he finished training, and discovered that the finish line was not the thing he had been promised. Gojo stares at him for a long moment, and then he laughs again. But this time the laugh is different from the surprised one earlier. It is quieter, and it sits in a different place in his chest. And it is the laugh of a man who has just been handed information about himself that he did not have before and is not entirely sure what to do with it yet, but knows that it is important. He says that Saitama is going to be very annoying, and he means it as the highest compliment his vocabulary contains, which Saitama probably does not know, and which Gojo does not explain, because some things are more honest left in their original language. What happens after the fight is not a resolution in the conventional narrative sense. There is no victor declared, no hierarchy established, no moment where one of them stands over the other and the score is settled. What happens instead is something more interesting and more true to who these two people actually are, which is that they stand in the destroyed intersection in the late afternoon light, and they exist in the specific companionable silence of two beings who have briefly, partially, imperfectly understood each other through the only language either of them fully speaks, which is the language of genuine, committed, maximum-effort physical exchange. And the understanding that has passed between them in that language is not about power levels or technique rankings, or who would win with no restrictions in a fight to the finish. It is about something much simpler and much more significant, which is that they have each, for the first time in a very long time, been in the presence of something they did not fully know how to solve. For Gojo, this is the beginning of something he does not have a name for yet, a reconfiguration of the internal architecture of his relationship with his own power, a slow and somewhat uncomfortable process of incorporating data that does not fit the model he has been operating from. He has spent his entire life at the top of his world's power hierarchy without ever genuinely questioning what the top means, without ever having to ask whether the top of one world is the same as the top of all possible worlds. And the answer he has received today is clear and specific and cannot be rationalized away. The top of one world is a location, and locations have coordinates, and coordinates exist within larger spatial systems. And the larger spatial system apparently contains a bald man from another universe who broke his own limiter and went shopping for cabbage this afternoon. This does not diminish Gojo. It does not make him less than what he is. But it does something to the quality of what he is, adds a dimension to it that was not there before, the dimension of a man who has encountered his own edge and found that the edge is not the end of the map, but just the end of the section of the map he was given. He will train differently after this. Not more desperately, not with the panicked urgency of someone who has discovered a weakness and is trying to patch it. Gojo does not do panic, and he does not patch weaknesses. He builds from them. But with a different quality of intention, a different depth of engagement with the question of what his power actually is and what it might become if the ceiling he has always assumed was the ceiling turns out to be just another floor. The jujutsu world will feel this change in him in ways it cannot immediately explain. A sharpness in his technique that was not there before, a willingness to push his own infinity to configurations he had previously considered unnecessary, a new and genuine interest in the question of what lies at the outer boundary of what the limitless can become. The students he teaches will notice it first, because students always notice when a teacher has been changed by something, even when the teacher does not announce it. He will not announce it, but it will be there. For Saitama, the aftermath is simultaneously smaller and larger than it is for Gojo. Smaller because Saitama does not process experiences through the framework of what they mean for his power or his development or his place in any hierarchy. He processes experiences through the much simpler and much more direct framework of how they felt, and how this felt was good, in the specific and irreplaceable sense of a feeling he had stopped expecting to feel. The feeling of a fight that asked him for more than his baseline and received it. The feeling of his own arm being surprised by what it was required to deliver. That feeling does not solve the larger problem of his existence, does not permanently repair the flatline that his victory over his own limits installed in place of the adrenaline he used to know. But it is a data point, and it is a real one, and in the specific emotional economy of Saitama's inner life, real data points are the only currency that matters. He found someone who made him reach, not reach far enough to find his ceiling. That ceiling, if it exists, is still somewhere above the altitude that this afternoon reached, but reach at all, which is something he had begun to believe the universe was no longer capable of asking from him. The universe, it turns out, had been holding out on him. It had been keeping this blindfolded, casually invincible, insufferably confident man in a different dimension until today. And today it finally put them in the same empty city in the same afternoon. And something happened that was not a resolution, but was better than a resolution, which was a genuine, mutual, unperformed recognition between two beings who had each been alone at the top of their respective worlds for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to look across a distance and see something looking back. Saitama buys the cabbage on the way home. He also buys the green onions he remembered earlier. He thinks about the fight on the train, which is unusual because he does not normally think about fights afterward, and what he thinks is not analytical but purely experiential. The feeling of that punch, the resistance in it, the way his arm had to commit in a way it had not committed in years. He thinks he would like to do that again sometime. Not for the purpose of determining an outcome or proving a point, or establishing anything about the relationship between their respective power levels, but just for the feeling of it, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of being in the presence of something real. He does not know if Gojo feels the same way. But if Gojo Satoru, sitting somewhere across town in a restaurant he considers barely adequate, staring at a menu, he is not really reading and replaying the afternoon through the total recall that his 6 eyes provide. If Gojo is smiling the smile that is narrower and quieter, and sits in a different place in his chest than his normal smile. The one that appeared when the blue failed, and when the red moved Saitama one step, and when the unlimited void failed to do anything, and when the punch came through the infinity, and when Saitama said pretty tough with no performance behind it at all. If that smile is currently on Gojo's face in that barely adequate restaurant, it suggests that yes, he does feel the same way, though he would frame it differently and at considerably greater length and with significantly more style. 2 men, 2 worlds. 2 beings who had each arrived at the absolute ceiling of their own universes and found, on the other side of that ceiling, not emptiness but each other, separated by the specific and unbridgeable gap of what they fundamentally are, and connected by the specific and irreplaceable fact of having genuinely, completely, honestly tried against the other, and discovered that trying still means something. That the feeling of genuine effort directed at something genuinely resistant is one of the few feelings in any universe that does not lose its meaning with repetition, that cannot be trained away or thought away or achieved away. That simply is, whenever 2 things that are real enough meet each other with enough honesty to find out what real means when it is tested. Gojo's world will never quite be the same, not because it has been broken or diminished or restructured in any visible way. The jujutsu hierarchy will remain what it is, the curses will keep manifesting, the sorcerers will keep fighting, and Gojo will remain at the top of all of it, as incontestably and completely as ever. But the top will mean something slightly different now, will carry within it the knowledge of a larger context, a wider map, a universe next door where a man in a yellow suit punched through infinity on a Tuesday afternoon on his way to buy groceries, and where that same man's face held, for just a moment, the expression of someone who felt something worth feeling. That is what this crossover is really about. Not the power scaling, though the power scaling is real and significant and has been laid out here as honestly as the available evidence permits. Not the techniques or the counters or the question of who wins, though that question has been addressed as directly as it can be addressed given what we know about both of these characters and what their respective powers actually mean when they make contact with each other. It is about what happens when 2 beings who have each gone as far as their world allows them to go finally stand in the same space and ask each other, through the only language they share, the question that every person who has ever pushed themselves to an absolute limit eventually has to ask: is there more? And if there is, what does it feel like to reach for it? The answer, it turns out, is that it feels like this, like one step back, like a punch that surprised the arm that threw it, like a smile that sits in a different place in your chest, like going home with your groceries and thinking about it on the train. Like something worth remembering.